Communication differences, particularly between men and women, are known. We've done studies of that. We have the data to tell us that the communication in men is different from in women. And, there's different things that we know about that break down, like women tend to pay less attention to power signals in communication and power roles. Why that is, there's all kinds of different reasons. I think the biggest is probably the cultural expectations we have of the role of men and the role of women. Historically we've heard the cliche, happy wife, happy life, indicative of the idea that the woman is the peacemaker. The home is happy if the woman is happy and they're making peace. Whereas the attitude towards men will refer to men as the breadwinner or bringing home the bacon. Even the terminology we use to describe a man, husband, father implies more competitive expectations from them. Whereas from women, we're expecting more of a homemaker, relationship, nurturer kind of role. So I think it's a lot of those beliefs that we've been raised culturally with that have impacted the way that it's different for men versus women to communicate. And we even have those expectations of ourselves. I think that is because of the cultural way that we're raised. If we're raised hearing constantly the feedback that as a woman we're successful if we have a peaceful, happy life, then of course we value that more than having power, and that's going to impact our value on power roles and power indicators in our communication. I think this is really actively changing. I think it already has been. I think it's going to continue to change. We're seeing more and more in social media and the way that children are taught. Things like, instead of a little girl is bossy, she's assertive. She's management material. Whereas before we would hear, don't be a tattletale, don't boss people around, stay out of other people's business. We're changing that attitude. And I think we'll continue to see that. I think, we're evolving as a society. Really, in my perspective, I think we have come, if we look way back in time, at one point in life, society was looking to manage just basic needs. Roof, shelter, we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Of course, the first things are food and shelter and just those basic needs. As a society, then we evolve to the next step and the next step and the next step. That's brought us through so many changes, including, the industrial age, and I think into an age of technological advancement. Right now, I believe that we're actively transitioning out of technological advancement into a mental health awareness and education phase. If you look at technology and the step changes that we see from one model phone to another, when iPhone first came out, it was a big deal, and the new model of iPhone that came out was a huge deal, and there was significant improvements. If you look at the changes one model to the next of phones and the competitive tools and points, one smartphone brand to another smartphone brand, they're pretty minimal. We're not seeing huge gains with each model launch. And I think that's indicative of the technological age sort of slowing down, and we're transitioning into the mental health awareness age more, where we are more aware of what we're doing, what we're doing is affecting us and our children, and changing the way that we're raising children and the way that we're interacting with other people. We have different expectations of men than my parents' generation did. I come from a generation that was raised by parents who expected children to eat all their food, show respect by compliance, boys will be boys, and girls should act in a way that's appropriate and not do things that encourage boys to make poor choices. Now we're learning and seeing children taught to have healthy relationships with food, emotional intelligence. We're saying it's not okay for boys to be boys. boys need to be treated like humans and respect other humans in the same way that girls need to be treated like humans and respect other humans, whether we're little children or adults. So I think that's really just a huge change that we're seeing and have been seeing for the last couple of years. It's going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to change how communication is happening between men and women, and I think it will narrow the gap in different communication styles between men and women. Formal and informal structure and authority. So in every organization, there's a formal structure, which we can see in the organizational structure. Some organizations may not have it written out, but most of the time they do. And it's going to be that pretty little chart that shows who's the boss and who reports to who and who reports up to them. And a different document may even identify what roles each of those teams or people are accountable for. And obviously that defines our authority. That defines who can write someone up, who's accountable for their team, all these kinds of things. But the informal structure is really more powerful than the formal, especially if the formal structure is not followed or acted upon. You can have a structure that says Joe Smith is the boss of Joe Dirt, and if Joe Dirt doesn't do his job, Mr. Smith is responsible for writing him up, coaching, teaching, whatever. But if Joe Dirt doesn't do it and no one's held accountable, then the formal structure really doesn't mean anything. Informal structure is always more powerful. If it's in cohesion with the formal structure, it's even more, it makes both formal and informal structure more powerful. So the informal structure is going to be really all of the relational type things, everything that's not written but drives the interactions. So I think probably the best way to define that is to say that the formal structure is the official in writing who's accountable for who, whereas the informal structure defines how things actually get done most of the time. Because maybe Joe Smith is responsible for Joe Dirt, but Jane Doe around the corner is the one who helps everyone. Mary at the front desk is the person who greets everyone and makes sure that the new hires have all the information that they need and connect them up with their new supervisor and make sure that they know all of the onboarding things that are supposed to be thrown at them that maybe their boss doesn't bother with, or maybe they do. Again, if they do, it just makes both stronger because they're working together. And so that formal structure really will define the authority and accountability. Like I said, my boss can write me up if I fail to do what he says. But the informal structure defines the mood, the vibe, the air, and the organization. And just because that informal structure doesn't give people authority, they can still subversively make my days miserable or make my days wonderful. Yes, the admin at the front desk doesn't have authority to write me up, but they can make my day start with a bright smile and a pleasant greeting, or they can start the day grouchy and grumbling, and they can make sure to point out any mistakes that they see to my supervisor. They can also be my ally. It really just depends. I think a great example in my experience of formal versus informal structure goes back to when I worked as the front desk in a chiropractic office. It's very, very common in small medical practices for there to be a husband and wife team within the practice where one person is the doctor and one person is the office manager. And it's really quite effective for the husband and wife and quite terrible for the employees, because what happens is that you have the formal structure as far as who reports to who, but informally the relationship of the husband and wife influences the office, except in rare occasions. There are people who manage that well. My experience, the chiropractor was not my supervisor, but he did have a position of authority as the chiropractor and the doctor in the practice. and I often worked during the evening hours when he was there treating patients. I reported to the office manager, which was his wife, and she would tell me, when XYZ happens, you need to do ABC. This is our policy. Okay, that's fine. But she worked 8 to 5, and when XYZ happened, the doctor, her husband, would say, oh no, you need to do this other thing. And even if I would tell them, hey, but my boss, the office manager, your wife, says this is our policy and this is what I'm supposed to do. Well, the doctor would usually say, well, it's fine, just do it anyways, do this. And so I've constantly found myself caught in the middle, because if I don't do as the doctor says, informal structure, he's going to be very frustrated and irritated with me and unpleasant to work with. If I do as he says, I'm going to make him happy, so my informal structure is pleasant. But my formal structure is not, because my boss, the office manager, is going to be very unhappy the next day when she comes in and finds out that I did not do as I was told, and I can be written up. So you have to really choose which one, if your formal and informal structure are not cohesive. Are you going to go with the informal structure, or are you going to go with the formal structure? Because they're just at odds with each other, and it puts employees in a really tough spot. Now, so one example would be the doctor saying, hey, leave the dog treats on the counter, so when our employees come in and they bring their pet with them, they can give them a snack, and they're encouraged to bring their pet in with them. But the office manager says, no, don't have those on the counter. We don't want to encourage pets in there, because she doesn't really like pets in the office. And that's her feeling, and so that's how she's pushing it through in the policy as the office manager. Well, then I'm stuck. Do I have the treats on the counter? Do I not have the treats on the counter? Experiences I've had where your informal structure and the formal structure are aligned and cohesive just make for so much better of an experience, particularly if that structure is positive. If it's negative, the value in that, if your formal structure is pretty terrible and the informal structure is also quite negative and terrible, it makes it really easy to know that it's time to move on, and that's not a good fit for you. Obviously, if both are positive, you're going to have a great, pleasant experience. It's much easier to know what's expected of you. You have positive relationships. Your team really becomes your allies, from your coworkers to your supervisor to different departments. It's just a much, much better environment. One expression I know someone likes to say is taking the oxygen out of the room. Informal structure either takes the oxygen out of the room or it breathes oxygen into it.